Welcome to this edition of Strata Originals podcast. I'm excited today to have Niels Veldhuis with us, the CEO of the Fraser Institute, which is Canada's biggest think tank and research company. Niels is also the incoming president of the Canadian Young Presidents Organization. And for those of you who don't know what that is, we can talk about that in a minute. So welcome, Niels. That was a
Leanne,
mouthful.
thanks for having me on. I'm delighted to be here.
And what an exciting time to get to talk to you, actually. There's so much going on in the world. Now,
Exciting is one way to put it, Leanne.
well,
Frightening might be another way.
Frightening, overwhelming. Yeah, absolutely. What strikes me, though, is how Canadians have come together, which,
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's right. Canadians certainly have come together, and if the hockey game was any indication, that certainly is the case. To be frank, I'm a little bit worried about our reaction to all of this, and we can get into that. But there's just no question that whether you're in Canada or you're in the U.S. or even globally, the level of uncertainty is at an all-time high. And that really is causing a lot of the economic results that we're seeing in the markets, obviously today, and across our country. So it is an exciting time if you're someone like me who analyzes the economy and policy. It's a frightening time as well because we really never have seen this kind of uncertainty and turmoil, and it's sort of a day by day see what comes next here as we learn what this administration in particular in the US is doing, and then how our governments here are going to respond.
it is interesting. So I've read some of the articles also on your website, which were really interesting. And the one comparison was we're playing checkers while the US is setting up for chess. And I love that analogy. But I want to first come back to something that we spoke about the first time we ever spoke. And that was, number one, I was a little bit intimidated. I don't intimidate easily, but I was a little bit intimidated because you're an economist, you're the CEO of the Fraser Institute. And I knew that you had been on stage with prime ministers and ambassadors, and you moderated the former presidents Clinton and George W. Bush in 2011, which is funny because I was actually at that in BC.
Great.
So it's funny. So I guess I'd seen you. But the moment we started talking, it was all of my little bit of nervousness went away because you can have a way about you that just explains things so easily. And the one thing you said to Alan was about everyone's entitled to their opinion as long as it's backed up in data. And we're very conscious of that now. So just quickly, how did you sort of get into research data, and were you born that way?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for those kind comments, Leanne, and for having me on. Economists aren't that scary. The way I think about economists is we're sort of like accountants, but with a little more personality, and that's going to rub accountants the wrong way. So, in any event, delighted to be here, and I guess, yeah, right from I would say an early age, always been interested in the world around me and why things were the way they are, why people make the choices they make. When you look at some choices that people make or politicians make, you think they're the wrong choices. Sometimes you think they're the right choices. But really, how do we develop opinions around that? And it wasn't until I got to college, and I took my first economics course, and really just, economics is really a study of how people go about making decisions. And it sort of opened my eyes to the empirical side of things that, if we can talk about something, then we can measure it. And that's the reason why measurement is so important. So we can have an argument, we can have a debate, we can talk about the way things are or the way things ought to be. But really, the only way to come to a solution is to look at what the data is telling us. And when the data changes, we should be changing our opinions. And ever since my first economics course, way back when in college, I've always sort of relied on that. Let's form opinions, or let me form opinions based on the data that I have. Not to say that the data is always going to be the best, or that there isn't better data. It's always, searching out for better data and being willing to change your opinions when you see different data. So that's really where my love of economics started, and I've been doing it now for a very long time.
It must be hard to debate with you.
Well, no, I don't love to debate necessarily. I like to have discussions. And I really do believe that when you have discussions and you respect other people's views, you can get somewhere really, really positive. And it doesn't have to be in the moment trying to convince people of your point of view, because that really is in part what a debate is. I like to leave little nuggets for people to think about after they talk with me, and I think that's more fruitful if you're trying to change how people think, rather than being an aggressive debater, which I can be at times. But I try to stop myself from that, because I think over time, if you just have a conversation and a respectful one, I think that works a lot better.
Yeah, because especially now during these times, uh, we all have opinions on
We do.
what should be done, what's happening, why it's happening. Being a Ukrainian Canadian, I feel like it's a double whammy, and it's an interesting time. So, what? Why don't you, according to data, kind of tell us the whole, a little bit of the state of the nation with the tariffs and our reaction to it?
Yeah, Leanne, I think before I get into the tariffs, I think I should just comment on the state of our nation, because I think it's really important to have that sort of base about how we've performed over time, because it does reflect what we might want to do going forward, and what we can do to offset some of the impacts that the tariffs are going to have. And unfortunately, Canada's in a very difficult economic situation, and I think Canadians are feeling that across the country. And the way that I measure that first and foremost is I look at income per person and what's happened to income per person over time. And unfortunately, pre-COVID, income per person was the growth in that was slowing over many years. And it certainly dipped during COVID, and then it rebounded. But if you look at the last 2.5 years, I mean, our income, what we call sort of GDP per person, has declined by almost 3% since midway through 2022. So the sort of angst that Canadians are feeling about their standard of living, a large part of that is driven by the fact that our incomes have declined by 3% over the last say two and a half years. So I think that's first and foremost. Secondly, what I really worry about is the business climate, the investment climate in our country. And when I look at that, that's where I really get concerned. And that's, we've deteriorated the state of our investment climate since 2014 in Canada. Internationally, we've become known as a country in which it's really hard to get things done. We've seen a very significant increase in the tax burden in this country. We've seen a very significant increase in red tape and the regulations in this country. I think we have a federal government who has tried to impede the development of some of our natural resources. And again, I'm not political, I'm not partisan. This is just based on policy. And I'm really quite worried about the state of our investment climate. And then for proof and evidence of that, I look at actual investment data. And when you look at that, it's really concerning. I mean, we've had almost $400 billion in investment leave our country since 2014. Wow. So there's been this flight of capital out of the country. And you have to ask yourself, well, here we are, we probably live in the best geography in the world, right? We have all the natural resources, we have an educated population, we're next to the world's biggest economic power. I mean, investment should be flocking to Canada, but why is it not? And then I look at investment per worker, because if we want to increase our standard of living, the way we do that is to become more productive, to produce the value, increase the value of what we produce for every hour that we work. And one of the key ways to do that is to have more investment. But investment per worker in Canada has declined by 20% since 2014. And if you look globally, in the US, it's gone up by 20%. And if you look at the industrialized countries and you take out Canada and the US, it's also gone up by 20%. So we're on a very different trajectory than many other countries around the world. And that's great concern for me. In addition to that, we're also dealing with the impact that inflation had on our country. Other countries have dealt with that as well, but in Canada, it's felt more sharply because we've seen incomes decrease and we've seen investment flow out of the country. So all of those things sort of wrap together, and you get a real level of anxiety across our country. And I'm fortunate. Part of my role, we have offices from Halifax to Vancouver, and I get a sense of talking to people and business leaders right across the country. And there's this real level of anxiety about our economic performance and how we move forward. Now, layer on top of all that, what's happening in the U.S., and that's just an added crisis that we probably didn't need, but we have to deal with. So here we are, and now we have to deal with what the U.S. is giving us. When I look at the economic results of the last, say, 10 years, that really has me worried about going forward, and in particular dealing with what we're seeing in the U.S. right now with the 25% tariffs. So there's a lot of angst across our country, and I really do believe there's a lot we should be doing internally to change, in addition to obviously responding to what's happening down south.
Yeah, for sure. So I know that markets were plummeting after yesterday. But before we get into that, so why has investment been leaving Canada? Is it policies? Is it the way we're dealing with our natural resources and our oil and gas and the regulations and legislation around that?
Yeah, so really interesting. There's not one thing, and it's all of those things, and it's not just oil and gas. I mean, we're seeing this across almost every sector of our economy, that we're seeing investment leave our country, whether that's the development industry, the manufacturing, across 10 of 15 sectors of our economy, we've seen a net outflow of investment dollars. So obviously deeply concerning. Why is that? Well, it all comes down to how attractive is your country for entrepreneurs and businesses to invest, and we haven't made it attractive. Most of these things are self-inflicted wounds. We have, for example, fiscal uncertainty, with these massive deficits and debt. Business leaders don't know what sort of tax levels we're going to face in the future. A great example of that was the recent proposal to increase the capital gains taxes. I mean, that sent shivers throughout the investment industry. You look at the level of regulations that have been piled on. You look at the amount of red tape that we're seeing across the country, the tax increases across the country, both federally and provincially, by the way, and also the approval process for large projects. I mean, this is something that's really, I think, impacted Canada's reputation. We've become, in the eyes of the international investor, as a country where you just can't get projects done. And I think that's a terrible, obviously a terrible thing for people to think about your country. So we have to change a lot of things in our country. Most of these are self-inflicted wounds. Most of the things we can do internally, which haven't done. And so when I think about offsetting the impact of the tariffs in the U.S., the first thing I think about is, well, what can we do to change ourselves? Right? What do we have control over? And we have control over a lot, and we can make this country much more attractive to investment. And I personally believe that's where we should start.
So where individually can we start?
Yeah, well, I think individually, I mean, this really is about changing government policy. And that's true federally, and it's true in many provinces, including where you are in Ontario and where I am in BC. We just need to make our environments more conducive to investment. And so, we're entering into this period right now where obviously we're going to get political change. We are going to get a new prime minister. There's a real opportunity for change, regardless of where you sit on this political spectrum. I think what we can do as Canadians right now is to really understand where we are today, why we're there, and how we change that. And that's really part of what we do at the Fraser Institute, is to educate people about all three of those things so that we can have a discussion that we need to change. We really do need a new direction for prosperity in this country.
In the meantime, what do you think, as a response based on the data that Canada has had? What did we do right? What did we do wrong?
in response to what's happening in the U.S.
The tariffs, yeah.
Yeah, listen, I look at the response that we've had today, which is that we're going to counter the U.S. tariffs with reciprocal tariffs. Personally, I think that's the wrong strategy. I'm a believer, based on data, that free and open trade is beneficial to whoever's trading. If you got two parties that want to trade with one another, they both benefit from that trade. And so, in that respect, I think the president in the United States is wrong with respect to trade. That being said, we're not going to win a trade war with the U.S. by putting tariffs, countervailing tariffs on goods and services from the U.S. I think that's only going to further penalize us. And if we started from a situation where both countries had tariffs, I would be arguing that we should remove our tariffs regardless of what the United States does. So I don't think we're going to win a trade war with the U.S. I think it's the wrong strategy. I think it might emotionally feel good for Canadians, but unfortunately, I don't think that's going to be the right thing to do. I think the right thing to do is, first of all, negotiate with the U.S. There's a lot of things and demands that the U.S. Want to see Canada do that we should be doing anyway. So we could offer them a whole bunch of things that we should be doing, like increasing our defense spending, making sure we secure the Arctic, for example. So those are things, and obviously the fentanyl issue is a massive one. And again, you can go onto our website. We've written on all of these issues, and I would recommend that your listeners do that. So let's deal with those things. Let's put a package together for the U.S. But most importantly, let's fix our own investment climate. Like, let's actually look inward and say, how are we going to make this country the best country for entrepreneurs and investors and people who want to work hard to come to prosper and to do well? I think if we did that, we could easily mitigate the damage of the tariffs. But from what I see across the country, whether it's provincially or federally, I don't see a lot of action in terms of fixing the things that we can actually fix.
So by lessening regulations and the red tape and the limits, like for the oil and gas and because of the carbon footprint and all of that.
Well, yeah. So let's just, look at the carbon tax, for example. This is obviously something that dramatically increases costs in Canada. And when you're a business and you're looking where to invest, and you have the Canada and the U.S., it's one of the factors. You're not going to go to a jurisdiction that has a higher cost base than another jurisdiction. So let's get really serious about reducing the costs of investing in this country. So taxation is one component, regulation is another. We have layered on, particularly with respect to net zero regulations, regulation after regulation after regulation, which is dramatically impeding our investment. Ross McKittrick, who's a senior fellow of ours, who's at the University of Guelph, has done some estimates about net zero regulations and what those do to the Canadian economy. And his view, based on his modeling of the impact, is that we're going to see a 7% decline in our economy as a result of net zero. Well, that's way bigger than what the 25% tariffs will do. So just rescinding those will offset the impact of the tariff. So again, I think it's a real focus on ours. We go back to what made Canada so successful in the mid 1990s to the mid 2000s. We had fiscal prudent, we had balanced budgets, we had governments of all political stripes, federally and provincially, looking to reduce the tax burden, looking to make us more competitive, looking to reduce regulation, and opening up the country to trade. So those are a whole bunch of things that we can do. And the other big one, of course, is internal trade barriers, because we haven't done a good job, obviously, of dealing with those. And that can be done extremely easily. I mean, if Ontario just said, listen, we're going to mutually recognize all the standards from across the country, we could easily deal with interprovincial trade barriers. But it's interesting that they haven't done so yet. Here we are. We've been faced with these tariffs. Really, Donald Trump's been talking about this for years, but we still haven't taken action. So I'm really hoping that we can put Canada on a path to action and actually change things that we can do something about.
Well, he did impose tariffs back in his last term too, right?
Yep.
And failed miserably. And then it ended up being lifted.
Well, listen, there's no question that over time, countries that freely trade do much better. I mean, free trade is a critical part of our prosperity. Specialization is a critical part of our prosperity, and we just have to look at ourselves. I mean, there's a reason, Leanne, why I don't make my own food because I'm not very good at it, right? So we all specialize in the things that we're good at, and countries do the same thing. And so free trade is hugely beneficial, and we should be focused on reducing trade barriers. But the reality for Canada is that we are very closely tied to the U.S. And despite some of the attitudes that we see across the country, I think our prosperity lies with deeper integration in the U.S. And so anything that we can do to really reduce the thickness of the border, I think we should be doing as a country.
Right. As long as we have the right controls at the border to stop the criminal activity.
Right, but listen, I think both sides want that. So we should be making sure that our borders are protected, that we're not flowing goods, both sides, U.S. and Canada, stop the manufacture and trade of illicit products back and forth. I do think we want to focus on the North and our Arctic security. I think that's something that when you talk to folks in the U.S. administration, that's something they believe we've significantly neglected. And then obviously our NATO commitments to our defense spending. This is something that we've dealt with for so long, and we've taken no action. So the first thing we should always do is look in the mirror and look at ourselves and say, what do we need to be doing better? And again, we're not doing that, and it's a real shame. And I think we all, when we think about our families and we think about our children, when we're faced with problems, we always encourage them to say, well, what can you do about it? Well, you can look in the mirror and how do you make yourself better? How do you make this situation better? And I think if we did that, we would start fixing our investment climate.
Interesting. Yeah, I know that the defense budget has been a big sticking point always. But one thing I've wondered that, probably a lot of people are asking, and it's probably politics, but, complaining about fentanyl coming from Canada to the US is the US Border Patrol. They're letting it in. It's not, I mean,
Well,
we're letting it out, but they're letting it in.
but it takes two to tango. And I think if and we do have a serious issue with illicit drug manufacturing in our country with and this has been pretty well documented with illicit monies from illicit activities coming into Canada and distorting some of in particular our housing market. So we've got work to do. And again, I think it's wrong for us to say, well, if it's an issue, then they should be tackling it. No, I think that's the wrong approach. I think we should be looking in the mirror and saying, yeah, but what can we do? Forget about them for a second. What can we do as a country? And so I think the first place to start is forget about the tariffs and forget about what they should be doing at the border or what they should be doing with immigration and say, no, what can Canada do? I mean, we need to be better at fiscal prudence. Like we need to balance our budget like Chrétien and Martin did, like Stephen Harper did. We need to get back to that tradition. Why? Because it creates so much uncertainty when people don't know what the future tax levels are going to be. So let's balance our budgets. Let's deal with that part, what we can deal with. Let's reduce our taxes, both personally and on businesses, right? Get rid of that capital gains tax. I would say let's create a rollover for capital gains taxes so people are incentivized to invest in new activities. Let's reduce the level of regulation and red tape that our entrepreneurs are feeling at every step they want to do something. They have someone just knocking them back in terms of regulation. And let's make Canada the best place in the world to invest. I mean, if we did those things, believe me, the positive results that would come from that would be so much more than the damage that's being imposed by the tariffs. And again, I don't think we should have tariffs. I think we should be doing everything we can to reduce tariffs. But first and foremost, let's deal with our own problems first.
And what's your response to the annexing Canada and becoming the 51st state?
Yeah, listen, there's a lot of things that the U.S. president has said in the past, and I think people just sort of shrug and say, "Well, that's ridiculous." I really do believe that the U.S. is extremely worried about Arctic sovereignty, that we're not taking control of the Arctic, and think that's probably what they're most concerned about in terms of if you leave the border, our security, our perimeter security, particularly around the Arctic. I think that they're the same thing. They're thinking about Greenland in terms of that's a real strategic area, and we need to secure that. Not we, but it needs security, and they look at Canada in the same way. And so that's really what I think we should be focused on. Rather than what the president says, let's actually focus on the things that we can do to help mitigate the impressions of Canada elsewhere. Because there's certainly an impression in the U.S., in the administration, in the armed forces, that we don't take our sovereignty in the North seriously. So I think we should change that.
Interesting. Let's talk about the interprovincial, because I found that very interesting. So do we actually have trade barriers amongst provinces?
Yeah, very significant trade barriers, different regulations, like different regulations on trucking, for example, different regulations on businesses, different recognition of labor. Like the fact that you can get educated in one province, but that you're not necessarily recognized in another, to me is almost bizarre.
Yeah.
If someone's a plumber or a framer in Ontario, I mean, really they should be able to do that anywhere without any sort of additional certification. So there's lots of things that we need to do to reduce our interprovincial trade barriers. But the best thing that we can do is to mutually recognize. I mean, goes the same thing for doctors, right? I mean, if you're educated in one jurisdiction that's a developed jurisdiction, like I don't like take England, why wouldn't we instantaneously say, well, if you go to med school in England, you're automatically recognized in Canada as a doctor, right? That seems to me pretty simple. And interprovincial trade barriers work the same way. We can just mutually recognize each other's standards across the country. There's no reason why we shouldn't do that. And we actually have a precedent for that, Leanne. We have BC and Alberta have long ago put in place what was called TILMA, the Trade Investment Labor Mobility Agreement, which reduced the interprovincial trade barriers between the two jurisdictions and later added Saskatchewan. So we can easily do it. We just need some leadership to get it done.
Yeah. It's odd because I know like a lot of students go across the pond to get into their pre-med. And so I'm surprised that we don't recognize doctors from the UK.
Right. I mean, they can come here, but they have to go through exams and lots of rigmarole. And why would we do that? That doesn't make any sense. If someone has a business degree from London, we recognize their business degree here as well.
So what would you tell the incoming prime minister, whoever that might be, as the first 5 top priorities for Canada economically to start getting our stuff together?
Yeah, great question, Leanne. And if you go on our website, we have an article based on a set of essays that we did over the last year, which is how do you reform Canada? And it's really a blueprint for prosperity for the country. And we have top 15 things we should do. So there's the top 5, but we have 15 things that we should easily be doing and setting in motion over the first year. I think first and foremost, we've got to balance the budget in 2 years. We've got to significantly reduce both personal income taxes and business taxes. We have to incentivize investment in our most critical industry, our natural resource industry. Natural resources broadly defined: oil, gas, minerals, agriculture, lumber. We have to make this country so the world's most attractive place for investment in resources. But then we have to extend that to the overall investment climate. So reducing the regulatory burden, I think, is definitely in those top 5. So those would be my top 5. And again, when you think about all of the net zero regulations, this is something that we're never going to achieve. As a country, we are not achieving net zero by 2050, but we are massively penalizing Canadians by putting up roadblocks to investment. And so I absolutely think that whole regime should be rethought, and we really need to get rid of the regulations to allow Canadians to flourish.
And maybe they could reduce a lot of the administration
Well,
federal.
I think, yeah, I mean, I agree with you. So I sort of wrap that into balancing the budget in 2 years. Obviously, we've seen a real massive increase in government spending that started well before the COVID recession. If you just think about federal spending per Canadian, that increased by 20% in the 5 years pre-COVID. So from 2014 to 2019, 20% increase. So we had a massive spending problem and I think a massive hiring problem, to be frank, at the federal level that was before COVID and certainly since the COVID rebound. So we're 5 years out now from COVID, and this is something we've got to tackle. I think if you think about the explosion in the public sector federally, it's absolutely something Canada has to tackle if we want to be more fiscally prudent.
It's interesting. I read one of the articles today on your site, and it was about we almost need a task force to go in and reduce the fat in the Canadian government.
No question. And listen, the great story here, Leanne, is we've done it before. Like we actually have a history of doing it, and that's why I'm optimistic that things can change. Look, I think, and a lot of young Canadians don't remember this, but a lot of Canadians in our generation will, because in the early 1990s, we had a major government debt crisis in this country. I mean, the Wall Street Journal in 1994 wrote an article called Canada Bankrupt, and they called us an honorary member of the third world, and they called the Canadian dollar the Canadian peso because of our government debt. And
Yeah.
what happened? That article set off a chain reaction. It actually tanked the Canadian dollar and massively increased our interest rate. And at the time, Chrétien was in office, and he put in place with his finance minister Paul Martin a plan in 1995, the 1995 budget, put in place a plan to review all of government spending at the federal level. They put it through 7 different tests, including can this be done by the private sector or not? And then they went about reducing government spending by 10%, over 10% in 2 years. So they balanced the budget in short order. So we're not talking about theory here. We're talking about something that Canada has done in the past, and we should absolutely do again right at this point in time, because what Chrétien and Martin did allowed us to become more competitive because it allowed for the room to actually reduce the tax burden significantly. And again, I think in this way, let's repeat history because it was very positive in the mid-1990s, and it can be very positive for us again.
Interesting. That's amazing. Thank you.
Well, we have an amazing record in Canada. Like the reality is unfortunately, we've moved away from a near 30-year tradition in this country. So if you go back and you look at the Mulroney administration, the Chrétien administration, the Harper administration, I mean, we can debate little differences, right, between all of them, but overarching was a theme that you had to be fiscally prudent, you promoted free trade, you focus on reducing the regulatory burden, and you focus on reducing the level of taxation in the country. Like all those things are marvelous things that led to Canada actually being a world beater. We had better economic results than the US, by the way, from 95 to 2005. So we had this rich tradition that we moved away from in 2014. So let's get that back and let's move Canada forward. And I really do believe if we do those things, regardless of what happens in the US, we're going to prosper.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for opening our collective eyes to a lot of things that probably a lot of us didn't know. And we'll post some of the links that you talked about, the reform, and that we'll put that in the description so people can easily access it.
Yeah, wonderful. And I will also say if they want to follow our work, we have an email distribution list that we send out our work on a weekly basis, and folks can stay up to date with the good work the Fraser Institute is doing.
And it's amazing, by the way, for keeping up to date on things, because I subscribe, so I'm wonderful. In the know now. Thank you so much, Niels, for taking the time today.
Thanks, Leanne.
Bye.